When I first thought about it, I thought about my grandparents all in Mexico, coming across the border at the time of the Revolution. First as copper miners, working for the railroad, a lot of laboring positions, and all of the foundation that built for my family and for me in this century now. It's quite remarkable. I love thinking about their story and have traced their story, like so many people do with their ancestors, going back to where they were, what they did, what were the conditions like. And it all led to me to wanting to tell more stories of more people, to see how that affects us both personally and then the bigger political picture, quite frankly. And so, as it turned out, a good part of my life was spent in politics. And in doing that, helping to represent communities, both in community groups and working for elected officials, I actually got more and more encouraged to listen to stories and to tell stories, knowing in the end they could affect public policy and the way things went for the whole community. When I say things, I mean decisions, decision makers, health and human services and education and all of those things that give quality to our life, that gave quality to my life. My dad and my mom were both born in Los Angeles. And my dad worked all his life in county government, and first as a laborer and then finally in management after affirmative action went into place in the late 60s. A good part of his life was with organized labor, represented by a union that made sure that we had health care, that we had savings, that we had our own home, that things were provided that were basic necessities for us. And both my parents worked really hard, and so our family was able to prosper in that, even though there were a lot of families working hard that didn't have that kind of fortune at the time I was growing up in East Los Angeles. When I think about how that background helped me to listen to other people when I got into politics, I always thought that was normal. Everybody came up that way. Everybody had a labor background. Everybody had grandparents from some other country, things like that. And I learned very quickly that decision makers especially do not necessarily either have the ear to their working class constituents or the experience to be able to relate to them. And so I was determined to continue in politics and to train more people with unrepresented voices to get into politics. I wrote a book with a colleague called Women Seen and Heard, encouraging especially women to be involved. Was able to do trainings for women in advocacy, both here in our state, also around the country, and ultimately around the world, especially in Latin America, where my family was originally from, and in Africa, where I lived for 2 years working in a small school. So that all comes from telling stories and listening to stories, passing them on as encouragers, and encouragement for the how-tos of life, encouragement for, yes, it can happen, encouragement that your voice makes a difference. It was kind of funny that storytelling interest and ability continued on when I worked on my PhD, but this time it was at a whole different level, because having been working at the highest levels of our federal government in the White House with one administration, I realized that there's another layer of decision making going on in our lives. It's not governmental, but it's corporate. And I started to look more closely in my PhD work in organizational development and organizational structures at who really is having a voice in corporations and in corporate decision making. And my dissertation ended up to be the stories of the 150 Latinos, all U.S. Latinos who serve on the Fortune 500 corporate boards, a significant and rare group. And my question was essentially, how did they get there? In the title, we call it caminos, or the trails, or the pathways. How did they arrive there? And so, in a lot of highfalutin academic terms, it is a network analysis of the career trajectories and networked relationships of those individuals that came usually first or second generation like myself, in Latin American background, to sitting on the most powerful corporations' boards in the whole world. There's a lot of work at Harvard where I was able to spend a bit of time training during my dissertation years on corporate boards. And I was shocked to see that they never really looked at the content of those boards, at the variety or lack of variety in those boards. It was a lot about the do's and don'ts of being on a corporate board, and of course the legal aspects and the financial aspects. But who makes up the discussion that's going on that will lead to a decision? Who's sitting around the table? So the dissertation came through the caminos, the pathways of the Hispanics or Latinos in the U.S. that sit on the Fortune 500 boards. Stories, what can I say? It's so funny to think about how that all works and how that worked into my career path, and more than that, into the conversation that I was able to lend my voice to, both in Washington, D.C., in New York, at Harvard, and in other places, and back here at home, too, in the local community. Because it's all pretty much the same story. Learning how to speak up, learning how to come forward, and on the other side of it, learning how to listen so that you hear the story that's being told. That's a big part of what I wanted to talk about at this time in my life, long past kind of the high points in my career. I'm learning to tell stories from history, which is really fun for me because I volunteer as a docent locally. I look at early colonial history in our country and in our state in particular. And I am looking between the lines of history to say what stories are not told here. And I'm working now as a novelist and beginning to tell the stories of the voices that never appeared in those history books. But as you can tell, had a huge impact on the decisions that were going on at the time with the very founding of our state, and really set in concrete the images, the impressions that individuals had about some of the very early inhabitants here in this part of our country. Stories.